Going back to the mandate after the end of World War I in 1920, I want to show you a map that you can see what's happening. So this map tries to show you the various mandates that was carved out of the Arab land, and to get an idea how this differed from Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. Remember, this is 1920, the actual implementation of Sykes-Picot. So the next map really shows Sykes-Picot and the mandate. So you could see that the French share ended up to be not as much as was promised in the Sykes-Picot. The British take the northern part of Iraq. Now, I want to digress a little bit and talk about identity of the people of the area as in this time as political awareness of the people is undergoing a transformation. Now, for a great majority of the inhabitants of that area, especially what we call Palestine, the identity with Palestine really was not there at first. This is a contentious statement. For example, Rashid Khalidi has tried to establish that the identities were there before. The problem with it is that you can't have the kind of data you need to prove your point, and that is to do a survey. And nobody had done a survey. My point is that for a majority of the population in a pre-mass political era, it is hard to have those identities sufficiently developed. So therefore, the people of the area really viewed themselves in terms of either their Arabness or in terms of this greater Syria. Many of them also, in fact, perhaps the majority, viewed themselves in terms of their clans and in terms of their extended family. There was, to be sure, a strong Arab nationalist movement, but only for about 5% of the population, mostly in the urban centers. The other 95%, again, as I've been arguing, as would be the situation in a pre-mass politics, regarded themselves in terms of their clans, in terms of their extended family. Also, I want to point out that in the two islands, the eastern Mesopotamia and greater Syria, the western island, the percentage of the Jews in the two islands combined was around 2 to 3% of the population. Within the area we call Palestine, however, the consensus figure for the percentage of the Jews stands around 11%. Now, what I want to do next is to give you a clue, a kind of a window into the British strategic thinking at this juncture, that is, at the end of World War I. Remember, one of the points I want to make is how little in touch the British were with the realities of the areas that they were trying to rule. Remember now, the Ottoman Empire really did serve a useful function for the British Empire because for them it served as a buffer to keep Russians in place. And as long as this was the case, that is till around 1900, they were happy and with the Ottoman Empire. They didn't want to see it fall. But after World War I and the fall of Ottoman Empire, the buffer was now gone, and the issue for the British was, how could they replace it? Certainly they did not think that the Arabs would be a reliable ally, because after all, they're incompetent lower races. But then there was a lot of thinking at that time among the British elite that if you can get a vigorous European people, that could very well protect their interest in the region. And therefore they started to look to the European Jews. This line of thinking is really beautifully captured in the following quote that I'm going to show you by the British Prime Minister Lloyd George, as he envisions in the most romantic way what he thinks the post-World War I Middle East would look like for the Britain. And here's the quote: "A restored Hellenic world in Asia Minor," that's the old Asia Minor, the old Ottoman Empire, "a nice Jewish civilization in Palestine, protection for Suez and all the links to India, loyal and obedient Arab states along the Fertile Crescent." And remember, the Arabs are in outrage after seeing how they've been betrayed, and this man has no sense of what has been happening. Protection for British oil supplies from Persia. This man doesn't have a problem in the world. Everything seems to be working just fine. So clearly this romantic vision was completely out of touch with reality. Remember, one definition of insanity is out of contact with reality. So one could say this man was insane. In sum, the origin of the sense of outrage, the main theme of this lecture, the betrayal lecture, comes at the end of World War I. Instead of being given independence that they had been promised by the British, the Arabs are subdivided between the British and their ally France, and the 1920 San Remo Conference formalizes this division under the League of Nations mandates of the Middle East. So basically, there are 4 mandates and an emirate. Iraq becomes an British mandate. Syria becomes a French mandate. So is the case with Lebanon, also a French mandate. Palestine becomes a British mandate. And then finally there is the Emirate of Transjordan, also for the British. The sense of outrage on the part of the Arab exists throughout the 4 islands, throughout the area, although it varies in intensity from region to region. In other words, all Arabs feel outraged to some degree, but some who feel it very, very intensely are willing to die for the cause and resort to terror to achieve it. All right, now going back to the Hashemite family, as I mentioned, Ali, the first son of the Hashemite family, ends up being defeated by another Arab family, the Saudis, the House of Saud. So Saudi Arabia, which later they named the land after, is not an imperial creation. So when we say British really created the borders in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia would be excluded, Egypt would be excluded, Turkey would be Saudi Arabia would be excluded, Iran will be excluded, Turkey will be excluded. But certainly Greater Syria would be included. The third son of Hashemite family, Faisal, he was the Arab nationalist, and therefore he was the one who wanted to unify the Arabs and create an Arab nation. Lo and behold, on November of 1918, 2 years before the settlement of the Middle East issues with San Remo Conference. On the basis of Hussein McMahon correspondence, Faisal establishes a national Arab government in Damascus. So in 1918, actually, Faisal tries to create that independent Arab state. Arab nationalists all rallied around Faisal. And in fact, they end up creating a new political party called the Arab Independence Party. Basically, that party was able to unify the leading Arab nationalist forces to support Faisal. In March 8 of 1920, delegates from many areas of Greater Syria, they hold a general congress and they name Faisal the king of Syria. However, if you remember, on May of 1920, you have the San Remo Conference. The League of Nations had opted for the mandate system, and Greater Syria is given to French, and Arabs are not going to get independence. So now, instead of Hussein McMahon correspondence, we have the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration being enforced. And under its terms, Greater Syria was now a French mandate. And the French move very swiftly. They are out to vanquish Arab nationalists, and they give an ultimatum to Faisal to leave. Faisal's defense minister is one Youssef al-Azma. He refuses to surrender. And he realizes that he's totally outgunned and outnumbered by the French, but nonetheless, he took a small band of soldiers and nationalists, and as I said, none of them were any match for the superior or far superior French forces. The Syrians take on the French, knowing full well that they're going to get defeated in the Battle of Maysalun on July 24, 1920. So by July 24, 1920, the kingdom is over. I also mentioned it was clear to the Syrian nationalists that they are going to lose this battle and they're likely to get killed. But they made their purpose very clear. By resisting the French takeover of Syria, they would be denying any legitimacy to the French occupation of their land. Had they not resisted, the French could have come back and said they had no objection to it. So they knew they had to die for the cause in order to deny the French any legitimacy. Meanwhile, the British feel a bit guilty about the fate of Faisal after he's being forced out of Syria by the French. So as a consolation for the loss of Syria, they offered Iraq to Faisal, even though originally they had promised Iraq to his brother Abdullah, the second son. The second son, Abdullah, as I mentioned, was very much angered by the treatment of his brothers and himself, and he decided to bring a contingent of Arab fighters to take on the French in Syria. Then the British asked him, how would he like to be the ruler of the area, which is now Jordan? And he said he would like it. So the Hashemite family ends up with two mandates, Iraq and Transjordan. And in the short run, this served the British purpose very well, because they were able to divide the area and they found puppet kings to rule through them indirectly. And remember, indirect rule was very important for the British because the empire was getting to be very costly. To rule directly, you had to bring your soldiers, You had to bring your whole state apparatus. And if you want to have an empire on the cheap, the best way to do it was to find indigenous puppet and you rule through them. Going back to Faisal, who now becomes the king of Iraq, he was a very cold but a very, very serious man. By contrast, his brother Abdullah was very colorful. And Abdullah really was not as committed to Arab nationalism the way Faisal was. And yet, look at the tragedy of it. The most prominent family, the Hashemite family, both brothers now find themselves in the role of a puppet caliph for the British. So the irony is that the family that played initially the role of liberation and united with Arab intellectual now finds itself in such a servile position working with the foreigners. So Hashemites are now seen as traitors by the Arab nationalists. Now I want to go back to Palestine. And in Palestine too, there were two great Palestinian families, aristocratic families. One was the Husseinis. They produced the top Muslim leadership. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was from this family. He developed a reputation of being a Nazi sympathizer. But in reality, he was not only not a Nazi, he was a very liberal individual, and his alliance with Germany was purely instrumental. The enemy of my enemy is my ally. Husseinis were Arab nationalists, and they were traditional and Islamic, and yet they were very much pro-change. So there's a kind of a apparent contradiction, because typically we associate traditional families not being part of these movements. So there's the Islamic part to it, there's a traditional part, and yet they are among the Arab nationalists. In fact, to score their Arab nationalist and secular thinking, the Husseini movements were always led by Christians, precisely to underscore that this is not a Muslim movement, but an Arab nationalist one. Only the very far left did not associate with them. The British had a lot of problem with Husseinis. And so they really were trying to do their best to see how they could entice them and bring them back. The Husseinis also attracted all sorts of Palestinian intellectuals. They are also represented, or they were later represented, in the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. So PLO really does have aristocratic elements in it. The other family are the Nashashibis. They were your good, moderate, responsible type, willing to cooperate with imperialists. And these people were viewed by most of their people as accommodationists, sometimes traitors. In fact, many of them in Palestine looked at them as traitors. Israelis also regarded Nashashibis as notables and people they could deal with, because they were more than willing to accommodate to Israel. A good part of the story of Palestine during the interwar period is this: the British working hard to keep the Nashashibis on top and earnestly trying to entice, to bring in the Husseini so that they would cooperate. But the Husseinis did not cooperate with the British. In fact, they became very, very anti-British.